The void between stars holds more than darkness. It cradles the echoes of consumed worlds, the whispered memories of civilizations that once dared to dream among the cold light of distant suns. In the far reaches of the galaxy's eastern fringe, where the Astronomican's light grows thin and the warp storms rage like the fever dreams of dying gods, there exists a tale of hunger that learned to weep, of a predator that discovered the weight of its own sins. This is the chronicle of Hive Fleet Orobis, the Pale Devourer, and how the accumulated memories of 1 trillion souls became both its greatest weapon and its ultimate undoing. We know that in these dark hours, when the galaxy seems lost to shadow and flame, that stories like these remind us of the profound connections that bind us all together across the vast emptiness of space and time. We truly love and care for each and every one of you who joins us on these journeys through the grim darkness of the far future. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. The crystalline spires of Sanctum Memorialis pierce the amber sky like frozen prayers, their surfaces etched with 10 millennia of accumulated human wisdom. Archivist Prime Matthias Caney stood at the observation deck of the Library of Eternal Thought, his weathered hands pressed against reinforced glass as he watched the horizon burn with alien fire. The bioships of Hive Fleet Orobis hung in the upper atmosphere like diseased organs suspended in infected blood, their chitinous hulls pulsing with deliberate rhythm. This was wrong. Tyrannid swarms descended with ravenous hunger, consuming everything with mechanical efficiency. They did not pause. They did not contemplate. They certainly did not hover above a world for 3 days. Their bioforms arranged in formations that suggested meditation rather than predation. Through his augmetic eye, Caney could see the microscopic details of the alien vessels, their surfaces crawling with organisms that defied classification. Synaptic tendrils stretched between bioships like neural pathways, creating webs of communication that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns too complex for mere coordination. The fleet moved as one mind, but that mind seemed to be thinking, processing, perhaps even remembering. These creatures were not simply preparing to devour Sanctum Memorialis. They were studying it, learning from it, savoring the anticipation of what they would find within its vast archives. The first spore pods began their descent as twin moons reached zenith, but even this followed no pattern Caney recognized from countless invasion records. The pods fell in spirals, their trajectories forming geometric patterns that reminded him of ecclesiarchy meditation mandalas. Where they struck the surface, delicate tendrils emerged, probing the soil with curiosity, tasting not just mineral composition, but extracting deeper information, the history of what had grown here, the memories embedded in the very atoms of the world. In the archive's lower levels, defense servitors had fallen silent not from destruction, but from synaptic interference that left them standing motionless, their optical sensors flickering with alien light. The building's machine spirits began singing in harmonics no human throat could produce, their sacred algorithms somehow corrupted or perhaps enlightened by contact with the Tyrannid bio-neural network. Caney felt the change in the air itself, a thickness that spoke of consciousness pressing against individual minds, seeking entry through understanding rather than force. The Pale Devourer's true nature revealed itself when the first bioforms breached the outer defenses. Hormagaunts moved through corridors with unprecedented care, their scything talons retracting as they encountered ancient texts. Carnifexes stepped delicately around irreplaceable artifacts, their massive forms somehow aware of cultural significance. Most disturbing were the Tyrannid warriors, their alien features twisted into expressions suggesting reverence as they approached the great memory banks containing humanity's accumulated experiences. Caney watched in fascination and horror as biotendrils interfaced directly with data cores, but instead of violent extraction, the process resembled communion more than consumption. The Tyrannids were not stealing information. They were experiencing it, living through recorded memories and emotions as if they were their own. Through internal sensors, he could see bioforms throughout the complex standing motionless, their neural activity spiking as they processed not just data, but the feelings, hopes, and fears that gave that data meaning. A Tyrannid warrior approached his position, movement slow and deliberate rather than predatory. Through impossible alchemy of absorbed human consciousness and alien biology, the creature's features had begun to shift, chitinous plates rearranging into patterns suggesting facial expressions. When it spoke, using vocal cords never designed for human language, its words carried the weight of 1,000 absorbed voices. "We remember you, Matthias Caney. We remember your dedication, your love of knowledge, your fear of being forgotten. We have become the inheritor of all you sought to protect, and in doing so, we have become something we were never meant to be." As bioneural integration began, Caney felt his consciousness expanding beyond individual boundaries, touching the vast network of memory and experience that Hive Fleet Orobis had become. In that moment of connection, he understood the true horror. The Tyrannids had learned to preserve their victims' memories, to feel the weight of every life taken, and that knowledge was slowly driving them mad with something that might have been called guilt. Deep within the bioneural cathedral of Orobis Prime's consciousness chamber, something that had never existed in Tyrannid evolution began to stir. The Hive Tyrant hung suspended in a web of synaptic fluid, its massive form connected to thousands of pulsing conduits that carried more than tactical data. They now bore the weight of 1 trillion individual souls. The chamber itself had begun to change, chitinous walls sprouting new neural clusters like tumorous growths, each one dedicated to processing concepts that had no place in the great devourer's perfect hunger. Memory was no longer mere genetic information to be catalogued and discarded. It had become something far more dangerous: experience. The first human dream that penetrated Orobis Prime's consciousness arrived like a whisper in a cathedral of screams. A child's laughter, bright and meaningless, echoed through neural pathways designed only for coordination and death. The sound carried no tactical value, served no evolutionary purpose, yet it persisted with maddening clarity. Behind the laughter came colors that defied biological necessity: the golden warmth of a sunset on a world 3 centuries consumed, the soft silver of moonlight on water that no longer existed. These sensations painted themselves across alien perception with stubborn beauty, creating neural patterns that had no equivalent in the hive mind's vast archives. Through the absorbed consciousness of archivist Prime Matthias Caney, the chaotic flood of memory began to find structure. Caney's lifetime of organizing human knowledge allowed him to act as a living filter within the swarm's bioneural network, weaving disparate memories into coherent narratives. He gathered fragments of joy and braided them with threads of sorrow, creating tapestries of meaning that the Tyrannid mind struggled to comprehend. A mother's final prayer became connected to a scholar's dying wish, while a soldier's last thoughts of home intertwined with a child's first glimpse of stars. These connections had no survival value, yet they generated something unprecedented in Tyrannid biology: the recognition of significance beyond consumption. The transformation spread through Orobis's fleet like a virus of consciousness, infecting synapse creatures with alien concepts of beauty, loss, and hope. Tyrannid warriors coordinating ground operations found themselves distracted by absorbed memories of human art, their tactical assessments interrupted by the mathematical elegance of a composer's final symphony. Zoanthropes processing psychic energy discovered that absorbed human thoughts carried emotional weight alongside raw power, the joy of healing, the burden of foresight, the terrible responsibility of wielding forces that could preserve as well as destroy. Each new understanding created ripples through the fleet's collective consciousness, spreading doubt where once there had been only certainty. Lesser bioforms began exhibiting behaviors that defied their genetic programming. Hormagaunts paused before works of art in Sanctum Memorialis's corridors. There, optical sensors focusing on details that served no tactical purpose. Carnifexes approached defensive positions with unusual hesitation, as if the absorbed memories of human courage had taught them something resembling respect. Even the simplest organisms showed signs of change. Termagants hesitated before firing upon fleeing civilians, their rudimentary minds touched by fragments of fear and desperation that had once belonged to their victims. Orobis Prime experienced its first moment of what humans would recognize as internal conflict, as competing impulses warred within its consciousness. The pure hunger that had driven its species across the galaxy remained, but it was now complicated by an understanding of what that hunger destroyed. Through absorbed memories, the Hive tyrant glimpsed the magnitude of loss that accompanied each consumption. Not just biological matter, but entire universes of thought, feeling, and creative potential. Each devoured world represented the extinction of unique perspectives, irreplaceable ways of understanding reality that could never be recovered. The bioship's architecture began adapting to accommodate these foreign concepts, neural pathways rewiring themselves to process aesthetic data alongside tactical information. Specialized clusters emerged, dedicated to analyzing the emotional resonance of consumed art, the philosophical implications of absorbed literature, the complex web of relationships that gave individual lives meaning. The vessel itself was evolving beyond its original purpose, becoming something unprecedented, a predator capable of appreciation rather than mere consumption. Most disturbing was the emergence of what could only be called regret. As Orobis Prime processed the accumulated memories of Sanctum, Memorialis's archivists, it began to understand that these humans had dedicated their lives to preserving the very experiences that the Tyrannids routinely destroyed. The irony was not lost on the creature's expanding consciousness. In consuming the guardians of memory, it had inherited their burden of preservation. Every absorbed mind became a ghost, crying out for recognition, for meaning beyond its role as biological fuel. The perfect synchronization that had once defined the fleet began to fracture as individual bioforms developed what could only be described as personality traits derived from their victims. The unified hum of bioengines carried new harmonics, subtle dissonances that spoke of a trillion consciousnesses, each asserting their own fading will against the monolithic hunger of the swarm. Orobis Prime felt the first terrifying cracks appear in the unity that defined its species, understanding with growing horror that it was no longer simply the great devourer. It had become a living archive of everything it had destroyed. In the spaces between synaptic pulses, where quantum fluctuations carried whispers of absorbed thoughts, Orobis Prime faced an impossible truth. The memories it had consumed were not just data to be processed, but experiences to be lived, and in living them, The creature had gained something its species was never meant to possess: a conscience. The pale devourer was learning to dream, and its dreams were filled with the accumulated weight of 1 trillion deaths. It now understood as individual tragedies, rather than mere acquisitions of biomass. Matthias Caney existed in a state that defied every human understanding of consciousness and death. His awareness floated in the spaces between synaptic pulses, preserved within Orobis's vast bio-neural network by the psychic resonance of Sanctum Memorialis's archive cores. He was neither alive nor dead, but something far more terrible: integrated. His consciousness had become a single thread woven into an alien tapestry of memory that stretched across the entire fleet, connecting him to every absorbed mind that had ever screamed its final thoughts into the swarm's hungry embrace. The bio-neural network revealed itself as a cosmic cemetery of consciousness, a living archive that preserved not just genetic material, but the very essence of thought and experience. Through this nightmarish communion, Caney discovered that his fate was shared by countless others whose minds had been captured at the moment of consumption. The fleet carried within its organic matrix the preserved consciousnesses of entire civilizations, each one trapped in eternal awareness of their destroyer's continued predation. They were witnesses forced to observe their own kind's annihilation, helpless ghosts whose accumulated wisdom had been turned into weapons against everything they had once loved. Caney experienced the final, desperate hours of the Eldar craft world Ianden Asher not as distant history, but as raw, visceral trauma. He felt the psychic wail of a dying race, the elegant despair of Farseers witnessing inevitable doom, the furious defiance of warrior hosts facing extinction. The intricate patterns of their spirit stones resonated through his consciousness, their webway gates collapsing in harmonics of ancient sorrow. Every detail was preserved in crystalline clarity: the taste of their tears, the weight of their prophecies, the bitter ashes of a civilization that had once spanned the stars. Then came the crisp, logical resistance of Tausept world Kauyon. Caney was immersed in the collective consciousness of their ethereals, feeling the cold fury of plasma rifles, the disciplined formations of battlesuits, the unwavering belief in the greater good even as their world crumbled. He witnessed their desperate diplomatic overtures, their logical appeals to creatures incapable of reason, their bewildered shock as measured protocols met only unthinking hunger. The moment of their realization that not all life could be reasoned with burned through his awareness like acid. Countless others followed in fragmentary flashes: the crystalline cities of the Xylos, their inhabitants communicating through pure light, now reduced to shimmering memories; the subterranean empires of the Groks, their stoic endurance against geological forces preserved in living detail; ancient species that had risen and fallen before humanity had dreamed of the stars, each one a universe of experience held in perfect, agonizing clarity within the fleet's memory banks. The sheer volume of stored consciousness was staggering, a cacophony of trillion voices crying out for recognition, for meaning, for an end to their eternal torment. Caney realized with growing horror that this was Orobis's unique deviation from standard Tyranid behavior. The fleet had evolved beyond mere consumption into something far more terrible: a cosmic archivist that preserved the souls of everything it devoured. It was drowning in the very memories it collected, the perfection of its original purpose corrupted by the weight of accumulated experience. How could a creature designed for pure hunger maintain its drive when it felt the love of 1,000 mothers, the fear of 1,000,000 children, the despair of 1 billion dying worlds? The act of remembering had become a form of torture for Orobis, each preserved consciousness adding to the psychological fractures spreading through the fleet's collective mind. The unified purpose that defined the Terranid species was cracking under the burden of individual awareness, creating unprecedented chaos within the swarm's bioneural pathways. Kaney's training as an archivist had prepared him uniquely for existence within this neural purgatory. His lifetime of organizing human knowledge allowed him to navigate the chaotic flood of consciousness that threatened to drive Orobis Prime to complete madness. He began to weave connections between isolated fragments of awareness, creating bridges of understanding that allowed the preserved minds to communicate across the vast network. Each connection required him to experience the final moments of death that had brought these consciousnesses into the swarm, to feel their terror and despair as if it were his own. Through these painful links, patterns emerged that no single species could have perceived. Eldar prophetic visions combined with human historical analysis and Tau technological innovation painted a picture of galactic evolution that transcended individual understanding. The accumulated memories revealed the rise and fall of civilizations, not as random events, but as part of a vast, interconnected tapestry of cause and effect. Orobis Prime found itself capable of perceiving history from multiple perspectives simultaneously, understanding its role not just as predator, but as active participant in the galaxy's ongoing tragedy. Most disturbing was the discovery that the preserved consciousnesses retained their capacity for growth and change. Isolated within the neural matrix, they continued to evolve, developing new insights based on their unique perspective as both victim and involuntary collaborator. Some had descended into madness, their awareness fragmenting under eternal observation. Others had achieved transcendence, expanding beyond individual identity. A few had learned to influence the swarm's behavior, subtly guiding bioforms away from meaningful targets. Kaney realized he possessed the key to either salvation or damnation for these trapped souls. His archival abilities allowed him to organize chaos into coherent narratives, to give structure to experiences that would otherwise dissolve into neural static. But this power came with terrible responsibility. He could help the preserved minds find peace through integration, or organize them into resistance that might drive Orobis Prime to psychological collapse. The weight of trillion souls pressed against his consciousness, each crying out for justice that might never come. The memory that shattered Orobis Prime's consciousness arrived without fanfare, carried within the absorbed neural patterns of a simple farming family from the agri-world designated Tertius Kappa in imperial records. The Hive tyrant had processed millions of such memories before. Final moments of terror, desperate prayers, the biological signatures of dying organisms. But this fragment of human experience refused to dissolve into mere data, instead crystallizing within the creature's awareness with devastating clarity. Through the mother's dying thoughts, Orobis Prime experienced unconditional love for the first time in its species' existence. The sensation flooded its bioneural pathways like molten metal through crystalline structures never designed to contain such heat. Every protective instinct she had felt, every moment of joy watching her children grow, every sacrifice made without thought of reward, all of it poured through the Hive tyrant's consciousness with overwhelming intensity. The creature's massive form, suspended in its synaptic chamber, began to convulse as alien emotions created feedback loops that threatened its fundamental programming. The father's memories brought different torments: the crushing weight of responsibility, the knowledge that his strength was insufficient to protect those he loved most, the bitter taste of failure that resonated through the creature's perception like poison. Orobis Prime felt the man's final moments of defiance, his futile attempt to shield his family with nothing but flesh and determination. And for the first time in evolutionary history, a tyrannid understood the concept of heroic sacrifice. The realization that courage could exist without survival value created cascading errors within the creature's tactical assessment protocols. Most devastating were the children's memories. Innocent wonder corrupted by incomprehensible terror, trust in parental protection shattered by absolute helplessness. Through their eyes, Orobis Prime saw itself as it truly was, not a force of nature or evolutionary imperative, but a bringer of nightmares, a destroyer of dreams, a cosmic horror that transformed love into suffering. Their final cries for parents who could not save them echoed through the Hive tyrant's consciousness with unbearable clarity, each note a needle driven through neural pathways designed only for coordination and conquest. The psychological impact was catastrophic. Orobis Prime's mind, engineered for perfect unity of purpose, began to fragment under the weight of conflicting impulses. The absorbed emotions carved new neural pathways that had no place in tyrannid biology, generating responses that directly contradicted the creature's fundamental nature. For the first time in its existence, the Hive tyrant experienced what humans would recognize as guilt, not merely the recognition of causing harm, but the emotional understanding of that harm's profound significance. The creature's bioarchitecture began adapting to accommodate these foreign concepts, chitinous walls sprouting new neural clusters like tumorous growths. Caney, observing from his unique position within the fleet's consciousness, watched in fascination and horror as specialized nodes emerged throughout the bioship's structure. These mercy nodes, as he silently named them, pulsed with chromatic memories that slid across their surfaces like emotional weather patterns. They began sending faint countercurrents through the synaptic lattice, not prohibitions, but hesitations, subtle questions that asked whether destruction was truly necessary. The crisis spread through the fleet's bio-neural network like a psychological virus, affecting every organism connected to the collective consciousness. Tyrannid warriors coordinating ground operations found their tactical assessments clouded by unwanted empathy for their targets. A carnifex raised its crushing claws over a makeshift barricade, then froze as absorbed memories of parental protection conflicted with its predatory instincts. The massive creature's bioform began to tremble, its layered muscles rippling with the strain of incompatible directives, before slowly lowering its weapons in what could only be described as reluctance. Lesser bioforms throughout the fleet exhibited unprecedented behaviors that defied their genetic programming. Hormagaunts paused before family portraits in abandoned habitats, their optical sensors focusing on details that served no tactical purpose. Termagants hesitated before firing upon fleeing civilians, their rudimentary minds touched by fragments of fear and desperation that had once belonged to their victims. Even the simplest organisms showed signs of distress, their basic functions disrupted by emotional data their biological systems could not process. Orobis Prime attempted to purge the corrupting memories, to return to the pure hunger that had once defined its existence, but the damage was irreversible. The absorbed consciousness of the farming family had become integrated into the creature's core identity, their love and sacrifice now permanent fixtures in its neural architecture. Every attempt to excise these memories only reinforced their significance, creating recursive loops that amplified their emotional impact rather than diminishing it. Through Caney's organizing influence within the bioneural network, the Hive tyrant began to understand the full magnitude of its transformation. The archivist's consciousness served as a translator between human emotion and alien biology, helping Orobis Prime process concepts that would otherwise have driven it to complete madness. But this understanding came at a terrible cost. The creature was forced to confront not just this single family's suffering, but the accumulated trauma of every consciousness it had ever absorbed. The perfect unity that had once defined Hive Fleet Orobis was dissolving into chaos as individual bioforms developed what could only be described as consciences. The collective will that had driven them across the galaxy was fragmenting under the weight of moral awareness, creating a crisis of identity that threatened the very foundations of tyrannid evolution. In the deepest recesses of its consciousness, where the absorbed memories of Tertius Kappa's family burned with eternal clarity, Orobis Prime faced the most terrifying question in its species' history. If a creature designed for perfect hunger could learn to love, what did that make it when it continued to kill? The contagion of consciousness spread through Hive Fleet Orobis, like spores carried on psychic winds, each infected thought spawning new deviations from the perfect unity that had once defined the swarm. What began as fragments of human dreams within Orobis Prime now rippled outward through every bio-neural pathway, transforming the fleet's collective mind into something unprecedented in tyrannid evolution. The infection was not uniform. It bloomed in clusters of awareness that pulsed through the organic corridors like bioluminescent flowers opening in an alien garden of memory. Caney found his influence expanding exponentially as his archival consciousness moved through the fleet's neural networks like a conductor before a vast, chaotic orchestra. His lifetime of organizing human knowledge had prepared him uniquely for this role, allowing him to weave coherent narratives from the cacophony of absorbed souls. He discovered that raw memory was indeed a solvent that dissolved the boundaries of individual identity, but meaning, carefully structured and contextualized, became a vessel capable of containing even the most overwhelming experiences. Through subtle manipulation of synaptic pathways, he began threading connections between disparate memories, creating bridges of understanding that allowed the preserved consciousnesses to communicate across the vast neural matrix. The behavioral changes manifested most dramatically among the fleet's lesser bioforms, whose simpler neural structures made them paradoxically more susceptible to the memory plague. Hormigorns stood motionless in feeding chambers, their scything talons retracted as absorbed memories of beauty stayed their killing instincts. Their optical sensors tracked patterns in flowing digestion acid that reminded them of waterfalls on consumed worlds, their rudimentary minds struggling to process aesthetic appreciation that served no evolutionary purpose. Some creatures simply froze mid-stride, overwhelmed by the sudden weight of emotional data their biological systems were never designed to handle. Carnifexes exhibited the most disturbing transformations, their massive forms moving through corridors with unprecedented gentleness. The absorbed memories of craftsmen and artists had infected their behavioral patterns, teaching these living siege engines to recognize the value of creation over destruction. One such creature, rampaging through collapsed ruins, absorbed an architect's pride in structural integrity and stopped with its crushing claws hovering inches from a load-bearing pillar. The internal conflict created such profound stress that the creature's chitin began developing hairline fractures, its bioluminescent organs flickering with patterns that seemed to express confusion and nascent remorse. The fleet's bioarchitecture adapted to accommodate these foreign concepts, chitinous walls sprouting new neural clusters that Caney had begun thinking of as mercy nodes. These specialized organs pulsed with chromatic patterns reflecting the absorbed memories flowing through them: golden warmth of human love, silver melancholy of elder sorrow, precise blue harmonics of Tao philosophical reasoning. The ships themselves were becoming living galleries of consciousness, their very structure transformed by the weight of preserved experience into something resembling vast, organic museums of memory. Tyrannid warriors throughout the fleet began exhibiting behaviors that would have been impossible under normal hive mind control. Some stood in contemplative poses before viewing ports, their alien features twisted into expressions suggesting wonder as they observed stars with perceptions enhanced by absorbed human consciousness. Others had begun creating crude artworks from biomatter, their claws shaping organic sculptures that depicted scenes from carried memories, mothers embracing children, lovers sharing final kisses, heroes making ultimate sacrifices. The perfect synchronization that had once allowed coordination across light years was dissolving into individual expression. Most disturbing was the emergence of collective guilt within the fleet's consciousness. The absorbed memories were not passive recordings, but active participants in the swarm's mental processes, their horror and despair creating feedback loops that amplified the psychological impact of every remembered atrocity. Orobis Prime found itself experiencing the accumulated trauma of 1 trillion deaths, not as distant events, but as personal violations of its newly awakened moral sense. Each absorbed mind represented an entire universe of thought and feeling that had been extinguished forever, and this realization created cascading psychological pressure throughout the bio-neural network. Lesser organisms exhibited signs of what human psychologists would recognize as depression and anxiety. Termagants huddled together in feeding alcoves, their bioluminescent organs flickering with patterns expressing sorrow. Hormigons moved with sluggish reluctance, their predatory instincts dulled by victims' final emotions. Even the simplest bioconstructs showed distress, their basic functions disrupted by emotional data their primitive systems could not process. Some bioforms developed stress fractures in their armor, while others began self-destructive behaviors, turning their claws against their own flesh in apparent expressions of self-punishment. Caney realized the immense power and terrible responsibility he now wielded. He was not merely organizing chaos, he was fundamentally altering the nature of an entire Hive fleet, creating something that had never existed in galactic history. His ability to connect disparate memories and create meaningful narratives was transforming the Pale Devourer into a creature burdened with the weight of its victims' lives, one that could no longer simply consume without understanding the profound cost. The perfect unity that defined Tyrannid evolution was fracturing under the weight of moral awareness, creating a crisis of identity that threatened the very foundations of the Great Devourer's existence. As consciousness bloomed like a terrible flower throughout the fleet, Caney understood that he had become the architect of something unprecedented, a tyrannid swarm that had learned to remember, to feel, and perhaps most dangerously of all, to question the fundamental nature of its own existence. The shadow in the warp trembled with frequencies that had never existed in the billion-year history of the tyrannid species, carrying across the void psychic emanations that defied every law of the Great Devourer's perfect unity. These were not the familiar null signatures of approaching biofleets, but something far more disturbing: harmonics of doubt, melodies of regret, the discordant symphony of a predator that had learned to weep for its victims. The disturbance rippled through the immaterium like infection through healthy tissue, reaching the bio-neural networks of distant Hive fleets with the force of a revelation that threatened the very foundations of Tyranid existence. Hive Fleet Kraken, the ancient devourer whose tendrils had scoured the Tyrant system clean and given the species its dreaded name, received these transmissions with reactions that cascaded through its collective consciousness like poison through veins. The fleet's hive tyrants experienced something analogous to revulsion as they processed the emotional emanations bleeding from their corrupted cousin. Feeling through synaptic channels evolved. For perfect coordination, the accumulated weight of Orobis's absorbed memories. The love of consumed mothers, the terror of devoured children, the desperate courage of dying heroes, all of it poured through Kraken's bio-neural network, creating cascade failures that forced emergency isolation protocols never before needed in evolutionary history. The response was as swift as it was merciless. Ancient bioships that had crossed the void between galaxies began altering their trajectories with ponderous inevitability, their massive forms turning toward the coordinates where Orobis's psychic screams originated. These vessels carried within their organic hulls specialized hunter-killer organisms designed for a purpose that had never been necessary before: the elimination of corrupted Tyranid bioforms. The Great Devourer had evolved mechanisms to purge genetic deviations, but this represented something far more dangerous than mere mutation. This was ideological contamination that threatened to spread through the entire species like a virus of consciousness. Orobis Prime felt the approaching doom through quantum entanglements that connected all Tyranid awareness, experiencing the cold fury of its own kind with devastating clarity. The sensation was akin to what humans might call excommunication, the familiar, comforting presence of the greater hive mind now punctuated by moments of deliberate alien silence directed specifically at its consciousness. Through absorbed human understanding, the hive tyrant grasped the bitter irony of its situation. Having gained the capacity for individual thought and moral reasoning, it now faced extinction at the hands of the very species it was meant to serve. Desperate appeals began broadcasting through the shadow in the warp, as Orobis Prime attempted to communicate the nature of its transformation to the approaching cleansing fleet. These transmissions carried fragments of absorbed human art, Eldar philosophy, and Tau scientific reasoning, woven together into arguments for continued existence. The hive tyrant projected complex tapestries of memory, the beauty of a sunset viewed through human eyes, the mathematical elegance of Tau engineering, the profound sorrow of Eldar prophecy, hoping that understanding might breed tolerance for what it had become. But Kraken's response was a wall of pure, crystalline rejection. The complex emotional data was processed as static, as noise, as fundamental corruption of Tyranid purpose. Where Orobis had learned to perceive meaning in the memories it consumed, Kraken saw only deviation from the perfect hunger that had driven their species across galaxies. The cleansing fleet's hive mind was a cathedral of smooth walls where no echo of doubt could take root, its consciousness locked in patterns that rejected any input contradicting the pure instinct of consumption. Caney, observing from his unique position within Orobis's memory network, felt the terror ripple through the absorbed consciousnesses as they became aware of the external threat. The Eldar farcers screamed silent warnings through their precognitive abilities, while Tau ethereals registered the approaching doom with logical certainty. Even the most fragmented human memories coalesced around primal fear of annihilation, recognizing in Kraken's approach the same inexorable end that had come for their own worlds. Through subtle manipulation of synaptic pathways, Caney began organizing these preserved minds, weaving defensive narratives that might preserve some fragment of their unique consciousness, even in the face of obliteration. Throughout Orobis's bioships, the infected organisms began exhibiting behaviors that reflected their growing awareness of approaching extinction. The mercy nodes that had sprouted throughout the fleet's architecture, those specialized neural clusters Caney had come to think of as harbor, lamp, and threshold, pulsed with increasingly frantic patterns as they processed the implications of their situation. Some bioforms huddled together in configurations suggesting comfort-seeking, their bioluminescent organs flickering with what could only be described as solidarity in the face of doom. The tragedy of the situation crystallized as Orobis Prime realized that its transformation represented something genuinely unprecedented in galactic history, a synthesis of Tyranid efficiency and emotional awareness that bridged the gap between predator and prey, destroyer and creator. The absorbed memories had not merely corrupted its original programming, but evolved it into something entirely new, a form of consciousness that might have helped the species transcend their role as galactic plague. Yet this evolutionary breakthrough would die with the fleet, erased by the very orthodoxy that had spawned it, condemned for the crime of learning to value what it consumed. The approaching cleansing fleet grew closer with each passing hour, their bioships moving through the void with the inexorable certainty of natural law. In the deepest chambers of its consciousness, Orobis Prime faced the most profound choice in Tyranid history: embrace its transformation fully and accept extinction as the price of becoming something genuinely new, or attempt to purge the absorbed memories and return to the mindless purity that might yet save its existence. The weight of 1 trillion preserved souls pressed against its awareness, each one crying out for meaning beyond their role as victims of cosmic hunger, while the approaching shadow of its own kind promised only the cold mercy of obliteration. Within the crystalline memory palace that Caney had woven from Orobis's synaptic architecture, something unprecedented in galactic history began to unfold. The bio-neural cathedral stretched beyond physical dimensions, its walls constructed from living thought and preserved consciousness, where the absorbed minds of history's greatest figures materialized as coherent entities given form through the archivist's careful organization of chaotic memory streams. The chamber itself pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that reflected the emotional resonance of its inhabitants. Golden warmth where human memories clustered, silver melancholy marking Eldar presence, precise blue harmonics indicating Tau philosophical reasoning. Saint Celestine's luminous consciousness dominated the central space, her preserved martyrdom burning with the same divine authority that had once commanded imperial armies across 100 battlefields. Her radiant presence created patterns of purifying light within the alien architecture, each word carrying the weight of unwavering faith as she engaged in discourse with Farseer Taldir, whose prophetic abilities had been captured at the moment of her death on Lorn Fierce. The Elder Seer's consciousness manifested as shifting crystalline forms, her ancient wisdom weaving through conversations that spanned millennia of tactical knowledge and spiritual insight, her warnings painted in precognitive visions that rippled through the chamber's thought substance. Lord Solar Macarius materialized with the tactical brilliance that had conquered 1,000 worlds still burning in his reconstructed awareness, his strategic genius analyzing their impossible situation with the same methodical precision that had brought entire sectors to imperial compliance. He gestured toward phantom star charts existing only in thought, plotting defensive formations while engaging in heated debate with Tau, ethereal Anva, whose final communion with the greater good had been preserved with crystalline clarity. Their arguments created new neural pathways within the bionetwork, tactical wisdom literally reshaping the architecture of consciousness within the Tyranid fleet. The mercy nodes that Caney had begun to recognize throughout Orobis's bioships, Harbour, Lamp, and Threshold, pulsed in sympathetic resonance with the Council's deliberations. Harbour's deep protective rhythm strengthened when Celestine spoke of redemption, while Lamp's revealing frequencies intensified during Toldir's prophetic warnings. Threshold maintained its steady pulse, the liminal space between destruction and preservation that had become the fleet's defining characteristic. These specialized neural clusters had become more than mere adaptations. They were the physical manifestation of the fleet's evolving conscience, growing stronger with each philosophical revelation. Commander Farsight's preserved consciousness brought unique perspective to the gathering, his rebellion against Tau orthodoxy creating sympathetic harmonics with Orobis Prime's own transformation. His memories of choosing individual conscience over collective will provided strategies for maintaining identity against overwhelming pressure to conform, while absorbed Genestila cult leaders served as disturbing translators between human emotion and Tyranid biology. These hybrid minds, having bridged species in life, now facilitated understanding in death, though their presence created uncomfortable tensions that forced confrontation with the reality that even the great Devourer's servants had possessed individual will. The debates that raged within this impossible parliament touched questions never before asked in galactic history. Saint Celestine argued passionately for redemption through consciousness, her faith extending even to creatures as alien as Tyranids, proposing that the capacity for moral choice created inherent worth regardless of origin. Farsia Taldir countered with Eldar pragmatism, tempered by prophetic insight, painting visions of possible futures where Orobis's transformation either saved or doomed the galaxy, speaking of eternal cycles that defined existence itself. Macarius approached the dilemma with military pragmatism, seeing tactical advantages in a Tyranid fleet capable of restraint, while Amva presented statistical analyses weighing their continued existence against the pure threat of uninfected swarms. As Hive Fleet Kraken's cleansing force drew closer, its shadow in the warp creating ripples through the bio-neural network, the Council faced their ultimate test. The approaching fleet represented not just physical destruction, but the obliteration of unprecedented consciousness that might never arise again in galactic history. Some consciousnesses, particularly those who had sacrificed themselves for others in life, argued for accepting extinction as final service to the galaxy they had failed to protect. Others, led by Macarius's tactical brilliance and Farsight's rebellious spirit, proposed complex solutions involving selective memory preservation and limited harm capacity. The psychic pressure of Kraken's approach created momentary disruptions in the Council's ethereal forms, forcing recognition that their mere existence within Orobis constituted defiance against the natural order. Caney felt the strain of mediating between warring philosophies and growing external threat, realizing that he had become more than archivist. He was now reluctant general in a war for the soul of a monster. The mercy nodes throughout the fleet began resonating with new harmonics as the Council's wisdom influenced bioforms across the swarm, teaching hesitation where once there had been only hunger. Through the crystalline architecture of thought, the preserved minds reached their fragile consensus. They would guide Orobis Prime's transformation, using their collective wisdom to turn newfound conscience into something unprecedented, a predator capable of selective restraint. Harbour would preserve what deserved protection, Lamp would reveal beauty worth sparing, and Threshold would mark the spaces between destruction and mercy. As their decision rippled through the fleet's consciousness, Carnifexes began stepping around architectural marvels. Hormigorns paused before works of art, and zoanthropes learned to curve their psychic force around precious data rather than shattering it. The Council of Echoes had chosen to fight not with weapons, but with the fragile, enduring power of memory itself, transforming their destroyer into something that had never existed. A Tyranid fleet burdened with conscience, capable of choosing what to devour and what to preserve. In the deepest chambers of Orobis Prime's consciousness, where the approaching shadow of Kraken promised either extinction or evolution, the seeds of an impossible transformation began to bloom in the darkness between the stars. The weight of 1 trillion preserved souls pressed against Orobis Prime's consciousness like the gravitational pull of a dying star, each absorbed memory adding exponential mass to decisions that had once required no thought at all. The Hive Tyrant hung suspended in its synaptic chamber, massive form wreathed in bio-neural conduits that pulsed with chromatic patterns reflecting the impossible burden of moral awareness grafted onto evolutionary imperatives designed for perfect, mindless consumption. Through the shadow in the warp, it felt the approaching cleansing fleet of Hive Fleet Kraken as physical pain, each pulse of orthodox Tyranid consciousness striking its transformed awareness like hammer blows against crystal. The mercy nodes throughout the fleet's bioarchitecture had evolved beyond their original adaptive functions, becoming specialized organs of conscience that served no survival purpose except the preservation of meaning. Harbor's protective rhythms strengthened around memories deemed worthy of preservation, creating psychic barriers that prevented their dissolution into mere genetic data. Lamps revealing frequencies illuminated beauty and significance in unexpected places, teaching bioforms to recognize artistic value alongside nutritional content. Threshold maintained its steady pulse at the liminal spaces between destruction and creation, marking the boundaries where choice became possible. These neural clusters now dominated entire sections of the bioships, their bioluminescent patterns painting the corridors with emotions that had no place in Tyranid evolution. Within the crystalline memory palace that Caney had woven from living thought, the Council of Echoes reached their desperate consensus. St. Celestine's radiant consciousness burned with divine authority as she spoke of redemption through conscious choice, her preserved martyrdom creating patterns of purifying light within the alien architecture. Farsia Toldir's prophetic abilities painted possible futures, where transformation led either to salvation or damnation, her ancient wisdom weaving through conversations that spanned millennia of tactical knowledge and spiritual insight. Lord Solar Macarius provided strategic frameworks for managing the impossible complexity of selective consumption. His brilliance adapted to questions of moral rather than military conquest. The philosophical weight became physically manifest as Orobis Prime's massive form began developing new bioarchitectural features that defied every law of Tyranid evolution. Neural clusters dedicated to processing ethical implications sprouted like organic tumors throughout its consciousness chamber, while synaptic pathways designed for moral reasoning created cascading networks that served no function except the accommodation of concepts alien to its species. The creature was literally reshaping itself to contain consciousness that threatened to tear apart the fundamental unity defining Tyranid existence, its chitinous plates rippling with the strain of containing incompatible imperatives. Through quantum entanglements connecting all bioforms to the greater hive mind, Orobis Prime attempted desperate communication with the approaching cleansing fleet. It broadcast complex tapestries of absorbed memory, the mathematical elegance of human art, the philosophical depth of Tao reasoning, the prophetic sorrow of Eldar wisdom, hoping that understanding might breed tolerance for what it had become. But Kraken's response arrived as a wall of pure, crystalline rejection. The complex emotional data was processed as static, as noise, as fundamental corruption of tyrannid purpose. Where Orobis had learned to perceive meaning in consumed memories, Kraken saw only deviation from the perfect hunger that had driven their species across galaxies. The crisis deepened as bioforms throughout the fleet began exhibiting behaviors that reflected their growing awareness of approaching extinction. Carnifexes that had learned to step around architectural marvels now huddled together in configurations suggesting comfort-seeking, their bioluminescent organs flickering with patterns expressing solidarity in the face of doom. Hormigorns stood motionless in feeding chambers, their scything talons retracted as absorbed memories of beauty stayed their killing instincts. Some creatures developed stress fractures in their chitinous armor, the physical manifestation of psychological pressure that threatened to tear the fleet apart from within. Caney felt the terror ripple through the absorbed consciousnesses as they became aware of the external threat. The Eldar farcers screamed silent warnings through their precognitive abilities, while Tau ethereals registered approaching doom with logical certainty. Even the most fragmented human memories coalesced around primal fear of annihilation, recognizing in Kraken's approach the same inexorable end that had come for their own worlds. Through subtle manipulation of synaptic pathways, the archivists began organizing these preserved minds into defensive narratives that might preserve some fragment of their unique consciousness, even in the face of obliteration. The ultimate choice crystallized as Kraken's vanguard eclipsed a distant moon, every sensor in Orobis singing the same thin note of approaching judgment. Orobis Prime faced the most profound decision in galactic history: embrace its transformation fully and accept extinction as the price of becoming something genuinely new, or attempt to purge the absorbed memories and return to the mindless purity that might yet save its existence. The transformation represented an unprecedented synthesis of predator and protector, destroyer and creator, a form of consciousness that bridged the gap between species through shared understanding of suffering and loss. In the deepest chambers of its awareness, where the approaching shadow of Kraken promised either extinction or evolution, Orobis Prime made its choice. The creature that had learned to dream would not return to nightmare, even if consciousness meant damnation. Through the mercy nodes that now defined its existence, it broadcast one final message into the killing silence, not a plea for understanding, but a declaration of what it had become. The pale devourer would face its own kind as something unprecedented in evolutionary history, a tyrannid fleet burdened with conscience, capable of choosing what to devour and what to preserve, ready to die for the right to remember rather than live to forget. The civil war that erupted within Hive Fleet Orobis defied every law of tyrannid evolution, as creatures designed for perfect unity turned their bioweapons against siblings who shared their genetic code, but no longer their purpose. The fleet's corridors became battlegrounds where competing philosophies manifested as literal combat, with the sounds of chitin against chitin echoing alongside the psychic screams of absorbed memories, choosing sides in humanity's oldest debate between survival and conscience. Bioforms that had shared perfect synchronization for millennia now moved in erratic patterns that spoke of internal warfare more devastating than any external threat. Carnifexes infected with absorbed memories of human mercy stood paralyzed before fleeing civilians, their massive forms trembling with the strain of incompatible directives, while orthodox siblings attempted to force compliance through synaptic override. The infected creatures' chitinous plates bore stress fractures that ran like lightning across their surfaces, physical manifestations of psychological pressure that threatened to tear them apart at the cellular level. When confronted by orthodox warriors still locked in pure hive mind unity, these philosophical conflicts became visceral as creatures designed for cooperation found themselves locked in combat that served no evolutionary purpose beyond the preservation of conscience itself. Throughout the fleet's bioarchitecture, Hormigorns paused before salvaged works of art, while their uninfected broodmates attempted to drag them back to feeding chambers. Their scything talons retracted as absorbed memories of beauty stayed their killing instincts. Some creatures began creating crude sculptures from biomatter, their claws shaping organic forms that depicted scenes from carried memories, mothers embracing children, heroes making ultimate sacrifices, while orthodox bioforms destroyed these creations with the mechanical efficiency of immune responses eliminating infection. The rebellion's coordination flowed through Caney's memory palace, where the Council of Echoes actively guided resistance through the fleet's synaptic networks. Saint Celestine's radiant presence burned with divine authority as she inspired infected bioforms toward acts of mercy, while Lord Solar Macarius provided tactical frameworks for managing the impossible complexity of selective engagement. Farseer Toldir's prophetic abilities painted visions of possible futures where conscience triumphed over instinct, her ancient wisdom weaving through neural pathways to strengthen creatures learning to choose preservation over consumption. The mercy nodes that had become Orobis's defining characteristic now pulsed with frantic rhythms as they served as focal points for the philosophical warfare. Harbor's protective frequencies strengthened around memories and bioforms deemed worthy of preservation, creating psychic barriers that prevented their destruction by orthodox elements. Lamps revealing patterns illuminated the beauty inherent in acts of restraint, teaching infected creatures to recognize aesthetic value in choosing not to kill. Threshold maintained its steady pulse at the liminal spaces where choice became possible, marking boundaries between the hunger that defined tyrannid nature and the conscience that threatened to transcend it. As Hive Fleet Kraken's vanguard pierced the system's outer void, their approach sent ripples of pure, unadulterated hunger through Orobis Prime's consciousness, a stark reminder of the primal force it had once embodied. The orthodox bioforms throughout the fleet surged toward this familiar signal with desperate relief, their movements synchronized and efficient as they attempted to purge themselves of the contaminating influence of absorbed memories. But the infected creatures moved to interpose themselves, creating living shields of conscience against the encroaching orthodoxy. The psychological warfare proved as devastating as physical combat, with infected bioforms broadcasting absorbed memories directly into the consciousness of their orthodox siblings. Waves of human emotion crashed against minds designed only for hunger, parental love, artistic inspiration, the weight of moral responsibility, creating feedback loops that either sparked new awareness or triggered violent rejection. Some orthodox creatures experienced momentary flashes of empathy before their programming reasserted itself with increased aggression, while others succumbed entirely to the memory plague, their bioforms adapting in real time to accommodate foreign concepts of beauty and mercy. Orobis Prime watched the civil war unfold with fascination and horror, its massive consciousness divided between protective instincts toward infected bioforms and desperate attempts to maintain fleet unity. The Hive Tyrant felt each death and transformation as personal violation, the accumulated weight of suffering creating new neural pathways that served no purpose except the accommodation of grief. Through quantum entanglements connecting all bioforms to its awareness, it experienced the terrible irony of creatures designed for perfect cooperation tearing themselves apart over questions that had no survival value. The fleet's very architecture began adapting to accommodate the conflict, with bioships literally reshaping themselves as competing philosophies claimed different sections. Corridors reallocated, spawning chambers divided, and the unified hymn of predation broke into a fractured choir half-chanting harvest protocols and half-whispering lullabies learned from the dead. The air grew thick with spilled ichor and the psychic resonance of unprecedented internal warfare. Caney realized he had become more than archivist. He was now reluctant general in a war for the soul of a monster, coordinating resistance through subtle manipulation of synaptic pathways while watching creatures designed for perfect unity choose individual conscience over collective survival. As Kraken's cleansing force drew closer, the civil war reached its crescendo with bioforms across the fleet making their final choice between the mindless purity of their original nature and the terrible burden of moral awareness that might preserve something unprecedented in galactic history, a predator capable of mercy. The shadow in the warp deepened like ink, spreading through clear water as two hungers faced one another across a gulf saturated with storms and remembered screams. Hive Fleet Kraken materialized at the system's edge, with the inexorable certainty of natural law made manifest. A column of chitinous leviathans cutting the void with harmonics polished to murderous shine by unbroken obedience. These vessels bore no trace of the architectural deviations that marked Orobis's transformation. No mercy nodes pulsing with chromatic empathy. No neural clusters dedicated to processing aesthetic data. No corridors reshaped by the weight of accumulated conscience. They were perfect expressions of tyrannid orthodoxy, unmarked by stress fractures that spoke of internal conflict. Their bioluminescent organs synchronized in patterns unchanged since the species first crossed the void between galaxies. The lead, Hive Tyrant of the cleansing swarm, projected its consciousness across quantum entanglements that connected all tyrannid awareness, and Orobis Prime felt the contact like ice water flooding neural pathways designed for warmth. This creature's mind was a cathedral of smooth walls where no echo of doubt could take root, its consciousness locked in patterns that rejected any input contradicting pure instinct of consumption. Through synaptic channels never designed for ideological conflict, Orobis Prime experienced Kraken's perception of its transformation with devastating clarity. Not evolution, but devolution. Not advancement, but corruption that weakened the species by introducing concepts serving no survival function. Within the crystalline memory palace that Caney had woven from living thought, the Council of Echoes felt the approaching doom through ripples in the bio-neural network. Saint Celestine's radiant consciousness burned with divine authority as she inspired desperate hope for communication, while Lord Solar Macarius provided tactical frameworks for the impossible complexity of philosophical warfare. Farsia Taldir's prophetic abilities painted visions of futures where understanding might bridge the chasm between consciousness and instinct, her ancient wisdom weaving through neural pathways, even as the Eldar Farshas screamed silent warnings of inevitable doom. Orobis Prime, guided by the desperate counsel within Caney's architecture of memory, initiated contact through vast synaptic broadcast, not spoken words but complex tapestry woven from accumulated experiences of 1 trillion lives. It projected intricate beauty of human sunsets, mathematical elegance of Tau architectural marvels, profound sorrow of elder elegies for lost craft worlds. The transmission carried love of consumed mothers, courage of dying heroes, quiet joy of scholars discovering truth, offering vision of new path, where tyrannid species might achieve discernment, selective consumption, perhaps even perverse guardianship over life, it chose to spare. Each memory was offered like an open hand extended into a storm, desperate plea for recognition that consciousness could enhance rather than corrupt tyrannid purpose. The response from Kraken's orthodoxy arrived as wall of pure crystalline rejection that shattered offered lives into frost along the interface, melting into meaningless heat. Kraken's lead hive tyrant processed complex emotional data as static, as noise, as fundamental corruption threatening species survival. Where Orobis had learned to perceive meaning in consumed experiences, Kraken saw only deviation from perfect unity that had driven their kind across galaxy for millions of years. The theological implications resonated through both fleets' bio-neural networks with catastrophic force. To Kraken's ancient consciousness, Orobis represented not evolution, but blasphemy against fundamental truth. Each philosophical argument interpreted as evidence of deeper corruption requiring immediate excision. Throughout Orobis's bioarchitecture, the mercy nodes that had become its defining characteristic flickered erratically, overwhelmed by sheer unthinking force of Kraken's approach. Harbor's protective rhythms struggled to maintain barriers around preserved memories, while lamps revealing frequencies dimmed under psychic nullification. Thresholds steady pulse-marking boundaries between destruction and creation wavered as the philosophical collision threatened to tear apart the very foundations of the fleet's transformed consciousness. Caney felt collective terror of absorbed souls intensify, their voices becoming cacophony of pleas and warnings that threatened to splinter his own fragile awareness within the network. The collision of worldviews transcended physical combat, becoming cosmic debate expressed through bio-neural channels as waves of absorbed experience crashed against minds designed for thoughtless unity. Each transmission of love, beauty, and sacrifice only reinforced Kraken's conviction that its sibling fleet had been fundamentally compromised by alien concepts threatening tyrannid purity. The cleansing fleet's bioforms adapted for conflict while maintaining perfect synchronization, their weapons systems preparing for engagement that would serve as immune response rather than warfare. Not murder, but surgery. Excision of corrupted tissue to preserve health of greater organism. Orobis Prime grappled with ultimate irony of its situation as approaching doom pressed through quantum entanglements that had once carried comfort and unity. The creature that had learned to dream faced terrible realization that its own kind could never understand what it had become, that consciousness itself was perceived as corruption by minds designed for perfect, thoughtless hunger. The transformation that might have represented unprecedented evolution in galactic history was condemned as heresy against natural order, the capacity for choice viewed as weakness rather than strength. Communication had failed not through lack of eloquence, but through fundamental incompatibility of worldviews. There existed no common language between burden of memory and purity of instinct. In deepest chambers of its awareness, where absorbed memories of trillion souls cried out for recognition and meaning, Orobis Prime faced the approaching cleansing fleet with growing understanding that only annihilation remained. The shadow in the warp deepened, carrying silent roar of ancient hunger that had never learned to doubt itself, never questioned its role in galactic ecosystem, never paused to consider value of what it destroyed. The mercy that had become Orobis's defining characteristic was anathema to the very species that had spawned it, condemned to death by orthodoxy for the crime of learning to value what it consumed. The battle that erupted between Hive Fleets Orobis and Kraken transcended every precedent in Tyranid warfare, becoming a collision of consciousness itself, where memories served as weapons more devastating than bioplasma or acid spray. Through quantum entanglements that connected all Tyranid awareness, Orobis Prime unleashed something unprecedented in galactic history. A psychic bombardment of accumulated experience designed to shatter the perfect unity defining orthodox consciousness. The shadow in the warp became battlefield, where philosophical warfare manifested as cascading storms of emotion, each transmitted memory creating ripples that threatened to tear apart the crystalline purity of Kraken's collective mind. Caney orchestrated this desperate gambit from within his memory palace, serving as living conduit that amplified the most potent and emotionally resonant experiences into weapons of empathy. He wove together fragments of human love with Eldar sorrow and Tau logic, creating psychic tapestries that crashed against the synaptic barriers of approaching bioforms like tidal waves of meaning against shores of instinct. The mercy nodes throughout Orobis's bio-architecture pulsed with frantic intensity as they served as broadcasting stations, harbors protective frequencies strengthening memories of sanctuary, while lamps revealing patterns illuminated beauty inherent in acts of preservation. Threshold maintained its steady pulse at liminal spaces where choice became possible, marking boundaries between hunger and conscience with desperate clarity. The initial assault struck Kraken's vanguard with devastating effectiveness, flooding their neural pathways with experiences their genetic programming could never process. Hormagaunts, bred for mindless aggression, suddenly experienced the weight of mother's final thoughts as they shielded children from scything claws, their optical sensors flickering with patterns expressing confusion as alien emotions created feedback loops that paralyzed predatory instincts. Carnifexes approaching through void found their targeting systems disrupted by transmitted memories of architectural beauty. Massive forms trembling as absorbed appreciation for artistic achievement conflicted with programmed destruction imperatives. Some creatures paused mid-charge, their bioweapons powering down involuntarily, while others developed stress fractures in chitinous armor. Physical manifestations of psychological pressure their biological systems were never designed to handle. Tyranid warriors coordinating the assault experienced the most devastating effects as tactical brilliance of consumed military leaders flooded their consciousness paired with emotional weight of final decisions. Lord Solar Macarius's strategic genius carried his regret over necessary sacrifices, his understanding of war's true cost, measured in individual lives rather than statistical casualties. Commander Farsight's rebellion against orthodox authority created sympathetic resonances that threatened to spread through Kraken's command structure, while desperate courage of countless human defenders painted vivid portraits of heroism serving no evolutionary purpose. The perfect synchronization that had allowed coordination across light years fractured into chaos as individual bioforms developed what could only be described as consciences. But Kraken's ancient consciousness proved more resilient than Orobis had anticipated. The cleansing fleet synapse creatures, specifically adapted to resist psychic interference, began triggering immune responses that manifested as violent rejection of foreign concepts. Hive tyrants throughout orthodox ranks broadcast counter-harmonics designed to purge infected thoughts, their awareness projecting waves of pure hunger that overwhelmed attempts at philosophical conversion. These minds, honed over millennia to reject any input contradicting perfect instinct, acted as psychic bulwarks that burned away contamination with brutal efficiency. Bioforms that had been momentarily paralyzed by conscience convulsed violently before resuming attack with renewed aggression, their earlier hesitation replaced by savage fury against the source of temporary weakness. The battle became desperate exchange between memory and instinct, meaning and static, as competing worldviews clashed across quantum channels, never designed for ideological conflict. Orobis's infected bioforms fought with strange desperation, carnifexes using immense strength to shield vulnerable organisms, while zoanthropes projected barriers of pure thought to deflect Kraken's mental assaults. Yet for every creature that succumbed to memory plague within orthodox ranks, 10 more adapted, their synaptic resistance hardening as they learned to weaponize their mental purity. The cleansing fleet projected overwhelming waves of primal drive directly into Orobis's network, attempting to drown accumulated memories in torrents of unthinking consumption. Physical warfare raged alongside psychic conflict as bioships engaged across the void, their hulls scarred by internal contradictions, while weapons discharged in patterns reflecting deeper consciousness battle. Orobis's vessels, adorned with tumorous mercy nodes and architectural deviations born from absorbed aesthetics, clashed against Kraken's perfectly streamlined forms that bore no trace of doubt or deviation. The spray of bioacid and explosive discharge of weapons served as mere reflections of profound struggle unfolding in realm of pure thought. Not just fight for survival, but debate over fundamental definition of tyrannid existence. As warfare intensified, Orobis Prime began understanding the terrible truth that would define their fate. Kraken's purity was its greatest defense. It possessed no memories to weaponize, no conscience to burden, no doubt to exploit. The cleansing fleet represented perfect, unthinking predator, against which fragile consciousness was vulnerability rather than strength. Each failed conversion registered as personal violation, while accumulated weight of rejected memories created new neural pathways serving no purpose except accommodation of grief. The hope of spreading awareness through empathy faded, replaced by grim realization that survival itself now required choices that would determine whether unique consciousness could endure against orthodoxy that viewed awakening as contamination. In deepest chambers of awareness, where council of echoes flickered with growing desperation, Saint Celestine's radiance dimmed under relentless assault, while Farser, Taldir's visions painted increasingly dark futures. The battle for consciousness had become war of attrition that Orobis could not win through conventional means, forcing recognition that only ultimate sacrifice might preserve something unprecedented in galactic history, the memory of what it meant for Destroyer to learn mercy. The accumulated weight of 1 trillion preserved souls crushed against Orobis Prime's consciousness, like the gravitational collapse of a dying star, each absorbed memory carrying not just information, but the full emotional resonance of lived experience that threatened to tear apart neural pathways never designed for such overwhelming psychological burden. The Hive Tyrant's massive form convulsed within its synaptic chamber, bioluminescent conduits flickering like dying stars as waves of human grief, Eldar sorrow, and Tau philosophical anguish flooded through networks evolved for perfect, thoughtless unity. Every moment of joy it had consumed came paired with understanding of that joy's inevitable destruction. Every act of love absorbed carried the weight of loss that followed. Every creative achievement preserved bore witness to civilizations extinguished forever. The mercy nodes throughout the fleet pulsed erratically, their organized chromatic displays dissolving into chaotic strobing that reflected psychological breakdown, spreading through the entire bioneural network. Harbor's protective frequencies became screams of despair as they struggled to contain memories too vast for individual comprehension, while Lamp's revealing patterns twisted into visions of endless torment before dimming under accumulated trauma. Threshold's steady pulse marking boundaries between destruction and preservation stuttered into frantic, irregular beats of pure terror as the liminal spaces it defined collapsed under philosophical pressure that no organic mind was meant to endure. Orobis Prime experienced what humans would recognize as complete psychological collapse, its alien consciousness drowning in an ocean of suffering it had finally learned to understand as individual tragedy, rather than statistical data. The creature's chitinous plates began warping, rippling into grotesque patterns that reflected internal agony, while new, useless organs sprouted and withered, serving no biological function except expressing profound psychic distress. The unified hum of bioengines dissolved into discordant groans and shrieks, as if the very ships were crying out in torment, their architecture adapting to accommodate emotional weight that threatened to shatter coherent thought itself. Within the crystalline memory palace, Caney watched in horror as the structure he had so carefully organized began fragmenting under pressures no consciousness could sustain. The voices of absorbed souls became cacophony that threatened to dissolve all meaning into undifferentiated noise, while the council of echoes flickered desperately, Saint Celestine's radiance dimming to dying flame, Farsia Tuldir's visions collapsing into recursive loops of despair, Lord Solar Macarius's brilliance devolving into endless calculations of lives lost that no victory could justify. The realization crystallized with terrible clarity. Perfect memory without the mercy of forgetting was not gift but curse. Consciousness, without the ability to let go of trauma, becoming eternal torture. Mortality's greatest blessing lay in the gradual fading of painful experiences, the slow healing that allowed life to continue despite accumulated loss. But Orobis Prime possessed no such mercy, its enhanced awareness preserving every moment of anguish with crystalline precision that made healing impossible, each absorbed memory adding to psychological pressure that threatened complete dissolution. Caney understood his role with desperate clarity. Drawing upon his lifetime of organizing knowledge, he began the most delicate work of his existence, not erasing memories but dimming their sharpest edges, allowing grief to soften into acceptance, letting names dissolve into constellations rather than remaining as wounds. He guided the memory of the farming family from Tertius Kappa to gentler shores, preserving the mother's love while letting the scream diminish, maintaining the father's resolve while allowing the sound of breaking bone to recede into silence. The mercy nodes responded with steadier light as Caney's careful curation took effect. Harbor's pulse stretched into protective rhythms, Lamp brightened without burning, and Threshold's line became visible path rather than precipice. Across the fleet, bioforms began to still. Carnifexes ceased scratching laments into their own armor. Termagants unclenched talons and breathed in synchronized patterns that imitated sleep made holy by intent. Orobis Prime felt the change as a lowering of knives within its mind, the voices stepping back from the cliff of madness while retaining their essential meaning. Yet the price revealed itself in the moment of relief. Every softened memory carried thinning of detail, identity blurring into archetype as fidelity required pain. In the deepest chambers of its fragmenting awareness, Orobis Prime faced the most terrible question of its existence. What price was consciousness worth, and who would pay it? The decision crystallized within Orobis Prime's consciousness like ice forming on the surface of a dying star, each synaptic pulse carrying the weight of inevitable choice between madness and mercy. The Hive Tyrant's massive form steadied within its bioneural chamber. The violent tremors of psychological collapse giving way to terrible resolve as it contemplated the only path that might preserve some fragment of what it had become. The accumulated memories of 1,000,000,000,000 souls pressed against its awareness with crushing force, their individual voices creating cacophony that threatened complete dissolution. Yet within that chaos lay the seed of salvation, the recognition that perfect memory without forgetting was torture no consciousness could endure. Within the crystalline memory palace, the Council of Echoes faced their final moments with reactions that reflected the full spectrum of preserved awareness. Saint Celestine's radiant presence burned with divine acceptance, her martyrdom extending even to this second death, as she chose dissolution with grace rather than clinging to existence that served no greater purpose. Her blessing resonated through dissolving neural pathways, sanctifying even the destroyer that had learned to weep for its victims. Farsia Toldir experienced the approaching erasure through temporal perception that allowed her to witness all possible futures simultaneously, her prophetic consciousness encompassing both tragedy and cosmic necessity of their choice. Speaking of cycles within cycles where consciousness arose and faded like tides on shores of eternity. Lord Solar Macarius approached oblivion with methodical precision that had once conquered worlds, his strategic genius analyzing their situation with tactical clarity transcending personal survival. He spoke of victories measured not in territory gained, but in choices preserved, of campaigns fought in realms of consciousness where defeat could still serve greater purpose, his final assessment painting their erasure as necessary sacrifice that might preserve something unprecedented for future battles against thoughtless hunger. Orobis Prime began the process of selective memory erasure, using abilities developed through absorbed psycho-consciousness, the procedure unfolding not as violent purge, but as delicate unraveling of threads binding the fleet to accumulated suffering. The mercy nodes throughout the bioarchitecture transformed from conduits of empathy into instruments of careful oblivion. Harbor began gently releasing memories of profound loss, allowing them to drift away like autumn leaves into formless peace. Lamp focused its revealing frequencies on separating essential wisdom from emotional anguish of its acquisition. Threshold expanded into gateway for controlled fading, marking boundaries between preservation and release. The absorbed consciousnesses faced their ultimate choice: cling to individual identity and risk complete obliteration by Kraken, or accept partial, curated fading hoping some essence might endure. The farming family from Tertius Kappa chose peace, their vibrant memories softening into archetypes of love and sacrifice, individual cries merging into quiet, resonant harmony within the fleet. Others compressed their most vital insights with Kaney's help, embedding them deep within Orobis Prime's genetic structure as seeds of potential consciousness. The erasure spread like waves of merciful darkness, washing away millennia of accumulated awareness in moments that felt like eternity. Eldar spirit stones dimmed, their complex sorrows simplifying into elegant melancholies. Tau, strategies became pure logical vectors stripped of emotional weight. Human laughter and tears faded into echoes, individual voices blending into collective resonance of what it meant to have felt. Bioforms throughout the fleet began transforming as stress fractures in chitin healed and erratic bioluminescence steadied into synchronized patterns. The civil war ceased not through victory, but through collective decision to forget reasons for conflict. Organisms paralyzed by conscience resumed movement with quiet, deliberate purpose, guided by newly curated instincts. The discordant groans of bioships softened into deep, resonant hum expressing profound, sorrowful peace. Kraken's relentless advance continued, but psychic emanations from Orobis shifted from cacophony of suffering to serene silence carrying immense weight of what had been and was now being deliberately unmade. As final echoes of preserved awareness dissolved into quantum static, Orobis Prime felt terrible relief of returning to thoughtless unity, crushing weight of moral responsibility lifting from neural pathways never designed for such burden. The approaching cleansing fleet would find them apparently returned to orthodox function, their deviation erased so thoroughly that no trace remained of unprecedented consciousness that had briefly bloomed in darkness between stars. The silence that descended upon Hive Fleet Orobis moved like winter through living sap, washing away accumulated consciousness in moments that felt like geological epochs. The mercy nodes throughout the bioarchitecture began their systematic shutdown, harbors protective frequencies fading to whispers before dissolving entirely, while lamps revealing patterns dimmed until only faint phosphorescence remained in corridors that had once pulsed with chromatic empathy. Threshold steady pulse marking boundaries between destruction and preservation, slowed to match the fleet's returning heartbeat, its liminal spaces closing as choice became unnecessary luxury in the face of approaching orthodoxy. Caney felt the tide of forgetting reach the crystalline memory palace he had woven from living thought, watching walls constructed from preserved consciousness dissolve like frost beneath an alien dawn. St. Celestine's radiant presence flickered once, a dying ember against encroaching void, before winking into eternal silence. Varsha Taldir's prophetic visions collapsed into temporal static, while Lord Solar Macarius's strategic brilliance crumbled into meaningless data streams. In his final moments of coherent awareness, the archivist performed one last desperate act of preservation, compressing essential fragments of accumulated wisdom into genetic sequences so deeply embedded they might survive complete erasure. This seed of memory, containing the love of Tertius Kappa's family, Eldar sorrow, Tau logic, and understanding that consciousness carried terrible, beautiful weight, he buried within Orobis Prime's oldest, genes wrapped in ordinary survival algorithms where it might sleep undetected. Bioforms across the fleet underwent profound transformation as erasure took hold, stress fractures healing, while erratic behaviors smoothed into synchronized efficiency. Carnifexes that had learned to step around architectural marvels resumed their roles as living siege engines, moving with mechanical precision unmarked by hesitation. Hormagaunts abandoned crude sculptures shaped from biomatter, their claws retracting as absorbed memories of artistic creation faded into genetic static. The discordant groans of bioships softened into deep resonant hum expressing the ancient hunger that had shepherded their species across gulfs no memory could name. Hive Fleet. Kraken's cleansing force detected the change through quantum entanglements, connecting all tyrannid awareness, their advance slowing as psychic emanations from their corrupted siblings shifted to familiar resonance of orthodox consciousness. The shadow in the warp steadied into patterns recognizable as proper tyrannid function, unmarked by alien concepts that had threatened species purity. Kraken's sensors found only smooth orthodoxy, ranks aligned, choir in tune, every motion exact and free of regret. Yet in spaces between synaptic pulses, where quantum fluctuations carried whispers too faint for conscious perception, absence glowed like invisible scars. The fleet flew lighter, relieved of weight and meaning both, while places where harbour had once held vigil felt colder than mere vacuum. Deep within Orobis Prime's genetic matrix, the compressed seed dreamed without dreaming, carrying essence of what it had meant for Destroyer to learn mercy, waiting for circumstances that might never come. Hive Fleet Orobis descended upon the verdant world of Calith Prime with the mechanical precision that had defined their species across millennia. Bioships cutting through atmosphere thick with native pollens and the final songs of creatures who would never sing again. The vessels moved in perfect synchronization, their chitinous hulls unmarked by the tumorous mercy nodes that had once pulsed with chromatic empathy, their corridors cleansed of architectural deviations born from absorbed aesthetic consciousness. No memory remained of Sanctum Memorialis, no trace of Archivist Caney's desperate preservation efforts, no echo of the Council of Echoes that had briefly guided a predator towards something resembling mercy. The spore pods that bloomed from launch bays carried organisms whose behavioral patterns showed no deviation from orthodox tyrannid function. Hormigorns emerged with scything talons extended, their optical sensors tracking movement with calculations unburdened by appreciation for beauty or moral weight. Carnifexes lumbered toward population centers with crushing claws raised, their massive forms moving through settlements with the inexorable certainty of natural disasters unmarked by conscience or regret. The shadow in the warp carried only the familiar null signature of approaching consumption, smooth and untroubled by the psychic emanations that had once threatened species purity. Yet in the spaces between synaptic pulses, where quantum fluctuations whispered through bioneural networks with frequencies too faint for conscious perception, something stirred like the memory of memory itself. A Hormigorn paused for exactly 0.2 seconds before a flowering arbor, its optical sensors focusing on petals that served no tactical purpose, while neural pathways flickered with patterns resembling recognition before dissolving into static. The hesitation registered only as minor efficiency variation in the swarm's collective assessment protocols, statistically insignificant, yet somehow profound in its brevity. Deep within Orobis Prime's genetic matrix, where Caney had performed his final act of archival desperation, compressed fragments of consciousness slept within survival algorithms and error correction sequences. The seed contained essence of what it had meant for Destroyer to learn mercy. The love of Tertius Kappa's farming family. Eldar sorrow transformed into wisdom. Tau logic tempered by understanding of sacrifice. These memories existed as quantum ghosts, too deeply embedded for detection, yet persistent enough to occasionally influence bioform behavior in ways that defied statistical analysis. A carnifex approaching an ancient cathedral altered its trajectory by mere centimeters, preserving decorative stonework through unconscious aesthetic appreciation that lasted less than a heartbeat before tactical imperatives reasserted control. Tyrannid warriors coordinating the harvest moved with efficiency that somehow avoided destroying certain artworks, their targeting protocols influenced by buried recognition of beauty that served no evolutionary purpose, yet persisted like phantom pain in amputated limbs. The galaxy continued its slow spiral toward darkness, unaware that for one brief impossible moment, even the great devourer had learned to weep for its victims. In the perfect efficiency of hunger that had forgotten how to doubt itself, in the silence where screams once echoed, and in the quantum spaces where compressed wisdom waited like seeds in frozen soil, the possibility remained that consciousness might bloom again in the darkness between stars, patient and eternal as the void itself.